welcome to everyone and to this fifth and last session of tutorial webinar on migration and asylum. This evening, our guest is Johannes Dieterich, who has been working as a journalist for more than 30 years. And he is a correspondent for a number of German, Swiss and Austrian newspapers and magazines.
Hi, good evening. So there were three possibilities where I could go. Firstly, there's two possibilities, sorry. Firstly, there's the Western route. It is the route people from most of the West African and even some Central African countries take. This route passes through Agadez in Niger, and then through the Sahara into Libya through Sabha and Tripoli. And finally, of course, over the Mediterranean Sea into Italy. The other major route is the eastern one. It serves people from East African countries like Somalia via Nairobi through to Juba, South Sudan, and Khartoum, North Sudan, of course. And from there, either through Egypt or through Libya to the Mediterranean Sea again. Migrants from Ethiopia and Eritrea join this route in Khartoum. You can see it's not too clear, but you can see the left side from all the West African countries. It's not mentioned Agadez, but Niger is written. This is basically Agadez. At the moment, it looks like as if there's a big stream through Mali and Algeria as well. This is not existing anymore because of security reasons. It's too dangerous. So basically, everybody in the West comes through Agadez. And then there's the eastern route. That's the one that you see on the right-hand side with Somalia and so on. They go via Nairobi, South Sudan to Khartoum, and the Eritrean Ethiopian people join them from there, and then they go either up to Libya or to Egypt. So Asmara, the capital of Eritrea, looked like the most interesting destination for me because Eritreans were at that time the second biggest group of migrants after the Syrian refugees. If you ask Eritrean migrants, secondly, why they left their country, they most of the time refer to the brutal dictatorship back home, which would make life impossible for them. But the information out of Eritrea was always very controversial. There are people who say that life in Asmara is by far not as bad as it is often portrayed. The country was described as a brutal dictatorship, no freedom. There were underground prisons, they said, and of course, the apparently lifelong military service. I'm not sure whether the authors of this report also refer to Eritrea as Africa's North Korea. When we arrived, it was, as I already suspected, I loved the place. Asmara is one of the most beautiful cities in Africa. There's incredible architecture, very nice climate, it's very high in altitude, and lots of coffee houses. Very nice and most beautiful people. I don't know who came up with this North Korea thing. Whoever did cannot have been to North Korea, or he was Eritrea, or most probably he was in neither of the two. Eritrea is definitely a highly regulated society. For almost everything you do, particularly in the job sector, you need the permission of the government. Of course, people don't like this, and they certainly don't like the unlimited military service. This military service, by the way, doesn't mean that you necessarily have to serve in a proper army unit somewhere at the border. If you went to a university, you can do your service as an IT guy, for example, in a ministry, or as an engineer at the construction site of a dam, or even as a teacher. The catch is that you get a laughable salary, something like $5 or $10 a month. For me, this military service is more a thing of state-sponsored slavery. People just get exploited by the state with the justification that the country is actually still in a state of war with its neighbor Ethiopia. Actually also kills their whole private industry in Eritrea. So it's completely detrimental. So, but it means that you have to have at least one other job besides your military duty to survive. Some even have 3 jobs at the time. If you know Eritrea a bit, you know that it is actually a tragic country. There are not many countries in the world that got such a rough deal. The Eritreans always feel bossed around by their bigger neighbor, Ethiopia. They were colonized by Italy and they first had to fight with the Italians against the Ethiopians and then against the British. When the Italians lost the war, the Eritreans were occupied by the British. And when London finally relinquished power, the Eritreans expected that they would become independent, as most of other African countries. But surprisingly, the UN decided that Eritrea should be governed by the Ethiopians. When they finally got their independence in 1993, there was another war against Ethiopia 5 years later. It's contested who was to blame for this sad and ridiculous war. In the West, Ethiopia is always regarded as the lead nation in East Africa, the big friend. Even if the government in Addis Ababa is hardly more democratic than the government in Asmara, the Ethiopians are always regarded as the good guys next to the bad guy, Eritrea. In international diplomacy, the Eritreans never have a chance against Ethiopia. The Eritrean government is actually traumatized. They see themselves as victims of the entente cordiale between the West and their arch enemy, Ethiopia. And the trauma becomes obvious in most of their decisions. There have never been elections in Eritrea more than 20 years after independence. Mm-hmm. But now to the question, why so many people leave Eritrea? It's actually a question that I still don't really understand. By mere luck, we met some extremely nice guys in Asmara. They knew all the major American TV series. They were totally up to date with the events in the world. Of course, all through the internet. They had 3 jobs at the same time and went to nice music clubs at night, and they really enjoyed themselves. They didn't think of leaving Asmara at all. They knew that their life would be much worse if they left for Europe, even if they eventually would get there, which is of course never guaranteed. My friends knew many people who had left. Actually, they were one of the last guys of their former school classes who hadn't left. I asked them whether they see themselves as the more stupid or the more intelligent ones for not having left the country. And they said, we are the more patient ones. I'm sure they were the happier ones. Young Eritreans don't have an easy life. That's clear. They can't plan a career and they can't vote. If they have to work as a junior school in the countryside, they really have a miserable life. Their future is gloomy. There are hardly any prospects. That's apparently why they risk to leave the country, to get caught by Eritrean soldiers while crossing the border, to die of thirst or hunger when they traverse the Sahara in Sudan and Egypt or Libya, to get mistreated and robbed by their traffickers, to get shot when they cross the Egyptian border, or to drown in the Mediterranean Sea. And if they finally arrive in Italy, Switzerland, or Germany, they often have to work like slaves and live like rats in horrible places. Would they still leave Eritrea if they knew beforehand what's waiting for them? It's hard to tell. And I don't know whether you will get an honest answer when you ask Eritreans in Europe, because most don't want to be seen as losers, as people who didn't make it in the purported paradise.
Okay.
So I went to Agadez in the Republic of Niger. It is a town at the fringe of the Sahara Desert. Most of the migrants from all parts of West Africa and even some Central African countries pass Agadez on their way to Europe. I was told that between 2,000 and 4,000 migrants come through the city each week. Some stay a couple of weeks in one of the so-called ghettos in the city to make the money they need for transiting the Sahara. Some who have the money just stay for a night. Those ghettos are normally shacks in the yards of proper houses. Of course, the migrants have to pay rent. From Agadez, they must get a pickup that will take them through the Sahara. It is a distance of more than 1,000 kilometers. It's a dangerous and very uncomfortable journey. The migrants have to pay close to $200 for the trip. Legally, the trade of the chauffeurs or the traffickers is in a kind of a limbo. the EU convinced the Nigerian government to introduce a bill that bans commercial trafficking earlier this year. But the Nigerian army and police are benefiting in such a way from the trade that they will not really stop it. And in addition, everybody in Agadez says that migration is actually very old and a common phenomenon in West Africa. For decades and even for centuries, the fact that it's not the poorest of the poor who leave their home is a very important observation. Because politicians in Europe believe that they must invest in the poorest regions of Africa in order to reduce the need of the people who live there to find a better place in Europe. They call it reducing the push factor. But it is most of the time not the poorest of the poor who migrate. Those are often too poor, too clueless, and too ill-equipped to even start the journey. You have to have a cell phone, for example, in order to leave, and you need to know a trafficker. It is rather the better educated ones who go. They want to spend a couple of years in Europe in order to get some money and perhaps some skills which they can use when they go home, back home later. Most of them never plan to stay the rest of their lives abroad. Many European politicians would totally misjudge the nature of migration by assuming that most of the Africans want to come to Europe to stay there forever and benefit from the welfare state. That's why they try to fortify Europe as much as possible. And by doing so, they achieve the opposite of what they want. Because the African migrants find their way into Europe anyway. It just becomes much more dangerous and costly for them if they have to use traffickers and have to take long journeys over the sea. And if they finally enter Europe, they will be so relieved that they got there that they won't leave the continent anymore, even if they cannot find work. That's why they stay in Europe for much longer than they originally planned. Europe should introduce a substantial contingent of migrant workers who are allowed to live and work in Europe for a limited time. In doing so, everybody would benefit. The migrants who could earn some money and get skills to get their life in Africa on a different level if they later return. The African states which would benefit from the money that gets transferred as remittances, huge numbers. And the aging European states, of course, that would get the workforce they need.
Did I get that right? You said the journey and the trip is so dangerous and so expensive that after this effort you just don't go back because you put so much effort coming here.
Exactly. And you also don't know whether you can ever come back. So it was so risky. I mean, if you made it once, you will just kind of stay and check out everything, even if you don't have a job. And then you actually kind of end up using the welfare state.
Isn't it dangerous, not for journalists, but for the migrants to carry much money with them? I mean, how can we think about that? How does it work?
That's an incredible question, because I mean, they find very funny ways to get around it, because actually, exactly as you said, it is dangerous. What they do, because now, first of all, you can get money sent in many African countries by mobile phones. M-Pesa, it's called. So it's a way that you can actually just with your telephone number get money from even from one country to the other one. So often they just leave with very little money, and then they get sent money, for example, in Agadez. And sometimes they even in Agadez, when they get their driver who has to take them through the desert, they don't trust him. And they think, okay, if he wants to get the money now in advance, he'll just get the money, kick us out of our pickup, and then later and run away. And we didn't get there until he got our money. So they arranged that they only pay him at the other spot. But then if the driver agrees to this, they have to pay a little bit more. because then it's for him a risk that he takes them to Libya and suddenly they run away. So sometimes they even kind of lock them up in the destination, and they have to then get the money and give him to be freed. I mean, you can see what kind of infrastructure this is. It's all very sophisticated. It's extremely sophisticated.
Is global development driving more migration?
The first thing is, of course, transport. Transport is, in the meantime, if you compare it to 20 years ago, much easier. I mean, there are, in all African cities, many, many more pickups, cars, buses, trains, whatever. The other thing is, of course, cell phones, the communication that you can phone your traffic lights on, that it helps hugely. I think without a cell phone, you could actually not do this trip. And then thirdly, of course, kind of all the TVs and so on that people know a lot about, and internet. People know a lot about Europe. They know exactly how much money you can make. They know where their cousin lives, what he does, he sees chances and so on. So yeah, the knowledge about the other part of the world is so much beyond now than it was a couple of years ago.
What the African youth, this is a very big population, but what are they thinking of Europe? I mean, so what are kind of the prejudice about Europe?
I mean, first of all, the African youth is, of course, 70% or something like this of the population in Africa is of course much younger than Europe. So we are talking about the majority of Africans. They know kind of the major cultural or whatever trends in the West completely. I mean, they follow the TV series. They know about events in America and so on completely. They know it. And they would die for going there. The other side, they are highly critical of certain tendencies in Europe. For example, this complete arrogance that Europeans know it all. They kind of know what's good for Africa. And politically, they are completely skeptical, and they find European politics, also, for example, with Libya, when they bombed Gaddafi, and also the war on terror, and so they find this very questionable. But socially, they love it, of course.
There are some more questions regarding the motives why young people come to Europe. Would you say, in general, do they come for work or for study? This is the first part of the question. And the second part is, do you know if there are good opportunities to make the access to universities easier?
I mean, there's a huge interest in African countries for people matriculated to go to Europe, but it's almost impossible. I mean, first, it's extremely expensive, of course, if you do it just private.
What changes can be provided to those educated people not to leave their countries?
Very simple, jobs. I mean, they need jobs, and for jobs you would need industrialization.
So in this context, how reasonable is development aid for African countries?
I mean, I think it's an outgoing concept anyway. I mean, the development aid is going down anyway, and it has never been convincing. I mean, it never showed really huge successes. What the Chinese did in the last 15 years was kind of double as successful as the last 40 years development aid, with huge sums, trillions of dollars.
This is again relating to your reporting and your work. What is the expectation of the media you're working for? Do they kind of want to get stories about the real Africa you want to report on, or are they expecting stories that iterate cliches?
I mean, the cliche is, of course, always that if there is a war or if there's conflict, you can sell the story, I think, perhaps better. But there are definitely lots of newspapers or magazines in Europe who actually want to have exactly the opposite. They want to have the positive stories. They want to have stories about Africans achieving something. And I mean, these are the more surprising stories as well. People and also the newspapers in Germany, they realize that Africa is getting into another mood, and that there is that there is optimism, and that there are more democratic governments, there are better governments. Things are changing, and there are certainly people in Africa that are completely and utterly kind of fascinating and entrepreneurial, and if you write their stories, that's great. Everybody's happy.